Hey there, welcome to episode 131 of Mike's Collection. I'm Mike, and the part of my collection that I'm going to be talking about today is my Masters of the Universe Origins figures. Now, I've been wanting to talk about these figures for a while. It's probably my fastest growing collection right now. This line, for all intents and purposes, really just launched this year, and I already have, 30 figures or so. Like it's growing quite quick. So I had intended to do a video where I covered all of the figures in one, but I quickly realized that that would be a really long video, and I have been trying to steer away from hour plus long videos, and I figure probably more of you folks will watch these if they're broken up into waves. So for this episode, I'm going to do Wave 1 of Masters of the Universe Origins. So before we get into looking at the Wave 1 figures, I do just quickly want to talk about a very brief history of Masters of the Universe on the off chance there's somebody here that maybe isn't that familiar with them. So anyway, HeMan and the Masters of the Universe, the line began, initially there was a toy line in 1982, and it ran essentially till 1987, so about 5 years. But those were key years for me as a child. I was like 4 years old in 1982, so it was like, very an important time during my development. So there was also a cartoon by Filmation, which I loved. There was comic books that came packaged with the figures, little mini comics, and then there was also other comics published by DC. And then there was eventually a live action movie that came out right around the time that the line was dying off, unfortunately. Now, in regards to my vintage Masters of the Universe collection, I just kind of want to mention that it was pretty small when compared to some of my other toy collections. Like, when I was very young, a lot of my collections, in my mind, seemed bigger than perhaps they were. Like, when I look back now at my vintage, childhood collections of G.I. Joes and Transformers, they were maybe 40 figures, maybe 50 figures, and now I've got hundreds of both of them. So, they seemed big at the time. But with Masters of the Universe, it was always a pretty small collection for me. I had 10 or fewer figures. So yeah, it was not a lot. When I would play He-Man, it was just a little shoebox full of figures that I could dump out and play with. Now the thing about it is me and my brother Doug, we collected everything together. So whether it was G.I. Joe, Transformers, or He-Man, we tended not to buy duplicates, but we would kind of split the line down the middle. Like when we get our first toy and all the figures were featured on the back of the package, we would do pixies and say, I want this guy, and he'd say, I want this guy. So we kind of knew early on which figures we were kind of assigned to collect. So Doug, being a little bit older than me, he had a few more figures. So if I had 10, he probably had about 15. But overall, our Masters of the Universe collection wasn't very big. And, me alone, I was missing half of the key characters. So when I first moved out on my own and I wanted to display my old toys, it's like, well, I didn't have a Cobra Commander in my collection because Doug had that. Or, when it came to He-Man, I didn't have Skeletor. I didn't have Beastman. I didn't have Trapjaw. These were all characters that Doug had. So our collections were split right down the middle. But regardless of being a small collection, Masters of the Universe made a big impression on me, and I really love these characters. Now, He-Man, the toy line and the cartoon did get revived in 1990, 91. It was kind of a new, more sci-fi kind of version of it, sometimes referred to as the New Adventures of He-Man. I never saw a single episode of it. I was kind of not interested in the toys or the cartoon at that point. So yeah, I don't have any of those toys that I can show you when I'm doing comparisons later. And then 2002, there was a new kind of upgrade to the show. There was a new line of toys that were sculpted by the Four Horsemen, and there was a new cartoon. I loved both of them. The cartoon was excellent. The toy line that accompanied it was also excellent. I really loved it, but they were very hard to find in my area. And it didn't go very deep. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to catch the attention of kids. So both the toy line and the cartoon were kind of canceled prematurely. So even though there were about 60 figures in that 2002 line, probably about 40 of those were variations of He-Man and Skeletor. So, you never got all the side characters that you really wanted to see. But then in 2008, the Four Horsemen worked with Mattel to create a new line of figures called Masters of the Universe Classics. And in my opinion, the Classics are the best versions of the Masters of the Universe that we're likely ever going to get. They were great quality figures. They were like what you had as a kid, except taller, more detailed, more articulated, more accessories. They were awesome. And it was a very expansive line. It ran for about 10 years, and there was a new figure, at least one new figure every single month for those 10 years. There was beasts, there was vehicles, there was castles. You got all the characters that you got in the vintage toy line from the 80s, plus new characters that we never got before that were from the cartoon or from the movies or from the mini comics. Some of them were brand new created characters. Anyway, the Classics line was fantastic. I loved it. I was a little late to the game, probably about a year late when I started collecting the Classics, but I was able to get most of the characters I missed in some form or another, and I was very disappointed to see that line fizzle out. And my understanding was that for the tail end of Classics, Mattel had given the rights over to Super 7 to produce these figures. And then Super 7 said, we lost the license. Mattel is taking it back in-house because they're planning on launching their own line of Masters of the Universe figures for mass retail. And me and a lot of other fans were curious, like, well, what's this going to look like? Are they just going to continue the Classics like we hope they do? But no, what they announced was Masters of the Universe Origins, which are these figures, the one I'm going to talk about today. And my initial reaction was like, well, this sucks, because these figures are pretty much everything I said about the Classics that was better. They'd kind of, taken two steps back for these figures. These figures were shorter. They were less detailed. They had less accessories. They were more built for children than they were for collectors. So that's great for kids, but, I wish they could have continued the Classics line for collectors. But, it seemed like this is all we were going to have. And I thought, I'm not going to get into that line. It's not going to be better than Classics. Why bother? And they opened up the line in 2019. There was a San Diego Comic-Con exclusive 2-back of HeMan and Prince Adam. So this was kind of our first look at what these Origins figures were going to look like. And I wasn't super keen on them. Like, they looked kind of like the classic toys, so I didn't hate them. It wasn't like a radical reinterpretation. It just, like I said, it seemed like a step backwards. So I was like, yeah, not really interested. And then in 2020, they did some PowerCon exclusives, which is like the He-Man specific convention. And in 2019, they did a 5-pack of some of the classic characters, including my favorite character, Merman, in what they called the Lords of Power 5-pack. And that name, Lords of Power, comes from like a working name that Mattel used in the very early days in the 80s when they were creating Masters of the Universe. And so it had that old name, and the characters were based on some old like prototype drawings and stuff, and they don't look like the characters we kind of grew up with and loved. So these were kind of like prototype style figures. But they were kind of cool, and I was kind of interested in them because we didn't even have those versions of those characters in the Classics line. So this was at least something kind of new. But the set was so friggin' expensive, and I couldn't justify paying the price for this Lords of Power pack, knowing that the figures were, kind of dumbed down. They were kind of simple and smaller. And so I was like, yeah, I'm not going to get into this set. They've already started out with all these packs that I'm not going to be able to afford and can't be bothered with. There was also, in 2020, there was a She-Ra figure. And we did eventually get a She-Ra figure in the regular line, but the 2020 PowerCon figure had rooted hair like a doll, like the classic, or like the vintage figure would have had. So, yeah, I wasn't planning on buying this line. But then, as more and more of them started to come out, and I would see them online, and then when I finally found them in stores, I got so excited, I just kind of bought them up without really even thinking about it. But once I had them in hand, I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to be all in on this line. And yeah, I kind of think they're awesome now. And like I said, it's growing fast. I've got 5 different waves of figures, plus some additional deluxe figures and vehicles and beasts and all that stuff. One last thing I do want to mention before we start looking at the toys is that I'm not going to go super in-depth on all these figures, talking about, all their articulation or all their paint apps. There's plenty of other videos online that can give you very detailed reviews of every little thing about these figures. This is going to be more or less about me sharing my thoughts on each figure, comparing it to some previous releases, and we'll talk a little bit about, the articulation, all that stuff. But I'll just preface this by saying I'm pretty pleased with all these figures. There's none that I don't like. So, now let's jump into taking a look at the individual figures. So we'll get started in the most obvious of places. This is the He-Man figure from Wave 1 of the Origins figures. So this is the hero of the line, the main character, and I really like it. I think most people that like this line liked this figure, except for the head. Some people weren't keen on this head sculpt. And I can understand that, but I like it. So, as I mentioned in the intro, I'm not going to take a ton of time to review everything about how every one of these figures moves. But since this is the first figure we're looking at, we might as well take a look at some details. So, actually, before I do that, I'm going to bring in my original He-Man figure that I had as a kid. And here he is. Now, he has seen better days. He's missing his harness, he's missing his sword, he's missing his shield, he's missing his axe. He does not have any of his accessories. At least he's still in one piece. I don't know if you can see in there. I'm reluctant to pull on it, but he's got like a black rubber elastic that holds his legs in place. And those things tend to erode over time. So a lot of the vintage figures, their legs are really loose. And when they break, it can be really hard to repair them. It's not easy to get in there. The elastic ties to both legs, and yes, I've never had to deal with it, but quite a few of my vintage He-Man figures are missing their legs at this point. So it is cool that my vintage He-Man is still in one piece. Besides his missing pieces, he does have one major injury, which is my baby brother, Brian, chewed up He-Man's hand. So he is very mangled. So that's kind of a bummer. But anyway, this head is what most people associate with He-Man. So that's the same kind of head that he had whenever they made new versions of He-Man, because there were multiple versions of He-Man in the original toy line, but he always looked like this, with this kind of angry face, with the kind of windswept hair. So I don't know if I can get this guy to stand up. Probably not, but maybe. Okay. So with this figure, so you can see how he moves. He doesn't have any joints in the knee. He doesn't have any swivels at his boots. His wrists don't move, his fingers don't move, his elbows don't move. So his articulation, and all He-Man in the old days, their arms swung like that, forward and backwards. Their legs were pretty movable because of the elastic, so they could do the splits and they could ride on horses and stuff like that. Their heads turned 360, and their waists, most of them had this action feature where you pull them back and they swing and do a punch. So they did have that turning ability at the waist, but you couldn't really pose them like that because as soon as you let go of him, he would swing back into place. So that was the articulation of the vintage figure. So with Origins, you can see as far as the size of them go, they're pretty spot on. You could probably even mix your vintage toys with the modern Origins toys, and they fit in pretty well. The proportions are about the same. Now the only thing is though, they have knee joints here, which is nice. So you can now bend He-Man's leg, which is something you couldn't do before. Now they have pretty ugly knee articulation. I don't know why they went with this, with the weird cap that comes over the knee. It's pretty ugly, like when compared to say Marvel Legends articulation or something like that. But regardless, at least we can move them now. He-Man here, he also has a swivel at the top of his boot, and his ankle here, you can see it rocks forward and backward, and also side to side a little bit. So a lot more movement in the leg. The waist, he spins, but he doesn't come flying back. He doesn't have that punch feature anymore. So you can actually pose him looking to the side. His arms, so he moves forward and backwards at the arm, but he also spins out. It's ball jointed and has this joint, so you get a good range of movement. You move it to all kinds of positions. He's got the elbow, so that that moves, and he's got his wrist swivels and bends forward and backward. So a lot more movement in the arms. And then the head, rather than just being able to turn 360, it's on a ball joint. So you can look around, look up and down a little bit. So yeah, much, much better. So accessories, this guy's got an axe, shield, sword. And just like the vintage toy, it's half of a sword. The idea being that you get Skeletor's sword and you snap the two of them together, and that would give you the key to Castle Grayskull. So that's kind of a cool throwback that he only has half a sword. So yeah, and the harness, it comes off. I'm not going to bother taking it off, but you can see here where it just connects. You can undo that, and you can take him off and have him bare-chested just like the vintage figures. So yeah, I think if you were a fan of this design, it's possible there might even be people that liked this and didn't like the Masters of the Universe Classics version, which I told you in the intro was far superior. But maybe some people are just feeling nostalgic. They didn't want figures to be taller and more detailed. So if that's their favorite, I think they could really get into this line because it's so true to the vintage line, just improved in all kinds of ways with the articulation. So the head sculpt. People don't like the head sculpt because it doesn't look like that one, but I like it. I think it's different. I don't want to buy a toy that looks the exact same as the toy I already have, because what's the point? Like if it was drastically different, if you had a mustache or a mohawk or something, that might be a little too extreme. But this is just a different take on that head, and I quite like it. So there you go. There's He-Man. Now before we move on to the next character, I do just want to bring in some figures for comparison. So here is, like I said, the original one from 1982. Now, I don't have any of the ones from the 1990s. I won't have any of those figures to show you. But then there was the 2002 reboot. So here's 2002 He-Man. And you can see he was a much more modern interpretation. He's very like manga or anime inspired. And he was much taller and just a pretty different look. Instead of the rather plain loincloth and belt, he had much more detailed sculpt. His harness is more detailed. He's got more paint apps. Still pretty limited articulation. Like you'll notice no knees, no elbows. So it was more articulated than the vintage figure. Like he's got the ball joints on the arms. Those arms can move outwards, and I think maybe some other places. But yeah, he's pretty basic, to be honest with you. You'll notice he still has the swivel punch action, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, I really liked that line. And then we'll get to the classics. Now, I was actually a little late to the classics. So they'd already put out Classics He-Man by the time I started buying the classics figures. And I already missed out on Battle Armor He-Man too. And those are the two most famous looks for He-Man. So the first He-Man that I got was Thunder Punch He-Man. So this is a recreation of one of the vintage toys. I think it was the third or fourth He-Man that came out. So the idea was that he had this red harness, and he had a backpack that you could put caps in and snap them, and a little smoke would come out. Now he's got a replica of a cap to be stored in his shield. I know if there's any young people watching this, you probably have no idea what that even is, but when I was a kid, you had little cap guns, and these things popped. They sounded really loud, and they released some smoke when you were playing guns. And Mattel integrated that into Thunder Punch He-Man, so when you made him punch, it made a really loud snapping sound and all that sort of stuff. So here's the classics version of Thunder Punch He-Man. Now, this head sculpt, again, some people maybe didn't like it. It was a little too far removed from this. This would have been the same head sculpt that came on the classic and the Battle Armor He-Man. But we did eventually get a head sculpt that looked closer to this, and a couple other head sculpts along the way as well. Now, I do actually have the gray harness, the gray shield and stuff for a classics figure. It came with another one of the figures that I have, the Goddess. So I could dress this He-Man up in his classic outfit, but this is the only version of Thunder Punch I have, so I've kind of opted to keep him like this. Now, the last He-Man I have to show you in his classic kind of getup is the Filmation version. So this is He-Man based on the cartoon look. And this is my favorite He-Man figure in my collection. This is pretty much perfect. It looks like it stepped right off of the screen, and he's got his whole classic look, classic colors. He's got the sword, the shield, the axe. I think this figure is pretty much perfect. So, love that one. Now, the only thing is like these figures are very expensive. They are, they were kind of expensive when they first came out. But they're very expensive now on the secondary market. If you wanted to go and try and find this figure, you'd probably be paying upwards of $100 for it. And, they weren't necessarily made for children. I'd be reluctant to take this out in the sandbox and play with it or something. It's, they are kind of intended more for adult collectors. So that's kind of the real appeal to the Origins line. Not that I'm going to take them out in the sandbox. I don't have any kids of my own, but if you were somebody my age and you like He-Man, you've got a son that you want to get into playing He-Man, son or a daughter, these are the figures that you'd want to take out in the sandbox. They're durable, they're fun, they don't have a ton of moving parts, like they're not so intricate, you don't have to worry about breaking them. So yeah, really cool figure. I like him. So we just looked at the main hero of Masters of the Universe, so let's take a look at the main villain. This is Skeletor. And yeah, I think he looks pretty great too. I think some fans might have also complained about this head sculpt the same way they did about He-Man's. Maybe it looked a little too silly for them because it doesn't really recreate the vintage head. It's got the right colors and stuff, but this one does look maybe a little cartoonier. But otherwise, he's got all the same benefits as the He-Man figure. He looks pretty much just like the vintage one, except with all this new and improved articulation, such as, the ankle swivels and the elbows and the knees and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, he looks great. I like this one a lot. And just like with He-Man, I like the new interpretation of the face. It's something different. For accessories, he's got his Havoc staff, and he's got his half of the power sword. So if I pop this out of his hand, you'll see here it's half a sword as well. So if I bring in He-Man's power sword, the two of them should snap together and give you, it's not perfect, but so that gives you the one full sword. And just like in the vintage toy line, once you have the complete sword, then you can open Castle Grayskull. So that's pretty cool. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, I did not have Skeletor when I was a kid. My brother Doug did. So I don't have the vintage one to show you. And just like with He-Man, Skeletor was one of the very first people, or one of the first characters that they made in the Classics line. So I missed out on the initial redo of classic Skeletor in the Classics line. So I do have the 2002 Skeletor that I'll bring out here. So just like with He-Man, this was kind of a more I don't know if this figure doesn't really strike me as anime, but you can definitely see how it's a more adult version of Skeletor. He's scarier, a lot more detail in the sculpt. These figures were sculpted by the Four Horsemen, and the Four Horsemen actually stayed on the brand. They're the ones that sculpted all of the Classics figures as well, but their initial take on Masters of the Universe was to update it into this new style before they went with a more classic look with the Classics figures. So I love this Skeletor a lot. I don't have these guys on display currently, and I haven't looked at this figure in a while. I'm pretty bummed to see this yellowing happening on his torso. His torso was the same color as his arms at one point, so that's disappointing. But considering that his face is yellow, you could almost look at it as he's slowly rotting away and maybe all turning into yellow bone or something. So that's one way I could look at it to make me feel a little better about the toy falling apart there and getting kind of gross. So yeah, I don't have the Classics version of Skeletor. What I do have, though, is I did get the Battle Armor version of Skeletor. So this is the second version of Skeletor that ever came out. And I like this one a lot. It actually didn't come with this head. It had a head that was much similar to that one, kind of more of a classic toy head. But this head came as a bonus with a totally different figure, Demo Man. And I like it so much. It's based on the mini comics that came with the toys in the 80s. So I replaced the head here. But this is his classic Battle Armor body. And yeah, so really cool. So there's the closest thing I guess I have to a Classics version of that Skeletor. Now I actually have this version here. This is Skeletor before he became Skeletor. This is Keldor. And you see, what I could do is whoops, too many figures here, not enough space. But if I took one of my Skeletor heads, either this one or probably even better, the more toy accurate head, I could put it on this body and it would be a lot closer to classic Skeletor. Some of the key difference would be Skeletor had these monster feet, whereas, and you can see that here, but Keldor has human feet because he hasn't transformed yet. Same thing with his hands and forearms. Skeletor always had claws and these kind of bony protrusions here. You can see that there. This Keldor doesn't have it. So it wouldn't be the perfect Skeletor, but I could do that. Let me get these guys out of here for a second. I do have a couple other weird Skeletors from the Classics line. This one is based on that weird 90s interpretation, like the New Adventures of He-Man, where it was much more science fiction. So this guy's kind of all techie and stuff like that. I doubt we'll see any of these characters in the Origins line, but who knows. And lastly, my favorite Skeletor figure that I have in my collection, just like with He-Man, is the Filmation version based on the cartoon. So this figure is pretty much perfect. It looks exactly like the cartoon. He's got his Havoc staff. He's got his sword. Looks great. Love this figure. So you might think, well, if you've already got these perfect versions of He-Man and Skeletor, why upgrade them? It's just because these guys are fun. They're simple, they're easy, they're fun, and I also haven't mentioned yet, they're affordable. Like these figures here in Canada are like $14.99. Probably in the States they're like $9.99, which is pretty much unheard of nowadays for like an action figure that you'd want to collect. So yeah, the price is right on these things, which makes them very appealing. So yeah, awesome stuff. So the next figure we're going to look at from Wave 1 is Beastman. So this is another classic character. He was released in the very first line of 1982 figures. I really love Beastman. He's one of my favorites. But it was my brother Doug that owned the original toy. So I don't have it here to compare it to, unfortunately. But yeah, this is a pretty great recreation of the classic, or I don't want to confuse things. When I say classic, I mean the vintage 1982 figure, not the classic figure from 2008. But yeah, he looks great. Lots of nice little sculpted detail there in the hair. He's got these hairy arms and the hairy chest and everything. So that all looks really good. Hairy legs. So yeah, I like this figure a lot. He's got his whip, which is really just like a string. Beastman's always had a whip, so that's cool that he's got that. And now before I do the comparisons with the other figures, one thing I want to talk about with these guys is the interchangeability of the parts, which is kind of cool. They're kind of meant for customizing. So I didn't touch on that with HeMan and Skeletor. But like if I bring out a vintage figure again, I'm going to bring out Stinkor this time. I don't have the Origins Stinkor yet, so this guy won't be featured in the video, unfortunately. So here's my chance to show him off. So this is the vintage Stinkor. Now the legs, like I said, are on those elastics, and they're not easy to change out, so you can't do that. Their heads, they don't come off easily either. I think you'd probably break it if you pop the head off. The only thing that you come off are the arms. The arms come off quite easy. So if I wanted to put He-Man's arms on Stinkor, I could do that. But that's the extent of the customizing. And I guess also you could have changed out their armor. Now my Stinkor is also missing his chest armor. But that was swappable between most of the characters as well. But with the Origins line, they're meant to come apart very easily. So the arms pop out just like that. The head pops off very easily. The torso comes apart very easily. I think the legs do too. I haven't pulled their legs off yet. I don't want to do it just in case I'm wrong. But I think the legs come off separately from the crotch piece there. So you can mix and match these pretty easily. You could put Skeletor's head on Beastman's body with He-Man's arms. So if you were into that, that could add a fun element of play that you didn't really get with previous versions of Masters of the Universe. So that's pretty cool. So I don't have the vintage one to show you. I do have the 2002 version. So again, you can see how different this figure is, very stylized. He's got kind of a big hunchback. He was a much larger character. You can see how tall this guy would be if he stood upright, because he's got these pretty big legs, but they're bent quite substantially. So he would have been quite tall if he stood up. So yeah, I really like this figure. And then the other one I have is from the Classics line. So this figure came out in 2008 or 2009, and you can see how it's got elements of this one, like they included these bony protrusions around here, but otherwise he's much closer to the kind of the vintage look of Beastman. So these are all great figures, but this guy, you know, he's just very bright and colorful, and he's fun. Next up from Wave 1 is Man-at-Arms. So this is kind of He-Man's confidant. He's one of the few people that knows that Prince Adam is actually He-Man. He is, well, his title is kind of in his name. He is like the weaponer, the armorer, I guess, of the kingdom on Eternia. So, yeah, he's a great character. Heavily featured in the vintage cartoon. And yeah, me and my brother actually both had this guy when we were kids. I'm not sure why we both ended up with him, but that was a rarity when we had the same figure, and we just used them as like different characters. And yeah, so this one pretty faithfully recreates the vintage figure with one major difference, and that is the mustache. The vintage figure did not have a mustache. His face looked pretty much exactly like this, just without the mustache. And the mustache, he always had it in the cartoons, and he had it in the live action movie, and he's had it in pretty much every media other than that vintage toy. So that always seemed like a glaring mistake. So here we go. Now we've got Man-at-Arms with the mustache, like he's supposed to have. And I think he looks great. He's got his club there, you know, and he's got all of his armor. He's got one leg and one arm all armored up, and he's got the chest armor. Yeah, looks good. I really like the colors. Again, these things are a little brighter than the vintage toys and everything, and I kind of like that. It just makes them look fun. So I don't have the vintage figure any longer. I don't know why I don't have it, but there were some of my vintage figures that I got rid of. I don't have my vintage King Hiss anymore. There's a couple other ones that I don't have. I don't have my vintage Stratos anymore. I don't know why. I wish I kept them, but I didn't. So the only figure I can bring out here to compare to, I've got the 2002 version. So this here was based on that 2002 animation, very stylized, but still clearly recognizable as Man-at-Arms. His armor is a little bigger, a little bit more intense. Still got his big mallet here. And yeah, just really great looking. Love this figure a lot. And then, like He-Man and Skeletor, Man-at-Arms came out very early on in the Classics line, and I missed out on the original version. And for quite a while, that was probably what I considered the biggest hole in my collection, that I did not have any version of Man-at-Arms. And then I was finally able to get one, and it's this one here. And this one is more based on the 2002 animation than it was the kind of the vintage toy or anything. You can tell that partly because he doesn't have his helmet on. He's got this little ponytail, which was directly from the 2002 cartoon. Just his armor looks more like the 2002 armor and everything. So I didn't have a problem with that. I kind of wished he had his helmet, but otherwise I really liked this style and this animation and everything. So I didn't mind that this was kind of my go-to Man-at-Arms and that I didn't have a more vintage style Man-at-Arms. But then I was able to get the Filmation animation figure, and here he is, and I think he looks amazing. This is exactly what Man-at-Arms looked like in the cartoon. So yeah, looks awesome. Love this guy. You really can't beat these Filmation figures. If you've got any of these are definitely the definitive versions of those characters as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, great stuff. So there you go. There is Man-at-Arms. So next up, we're going to take a look at the last of the heroic characters in Wave 1. This is Tila. Now, Tila is one of the main characters of Masters of the Universe. I don't know if you watched the most recent He-Man Revelation cartoon, but she really took on a starring role there. So yeah, she's a great character. And so it makes sense that they would include her in Wave 1. And so she's a little different. So maybe I should show you the articulation on her a little bit, because her body type obviously is completely different from He-Man and the other guys. They all basically shared the same kind of sculpt, and you could easily swap their arms and their legs and stuff. It doesn't quite work the same with the female figures because their physique is so different. So a lot more slender. Like the arms, I don't think this would fit. Like the arms still come off. I think the arms come off of these figures, but I was just tugging on it and didn't seem to want to give, so I don't want to risk breaking her. Although every one of these figures, when you open them up, they do come with little instruction. It's just like a folded up piece of paper that tells you what pieces can detach. For most figures, it's all the same. Their head, their arms, their legs. But there are a few figures that are a little different, so it's nice that they specify to make sure nobody breaks their figures. But this is one of the figures that I've had for a little while now. I didn't bother to keep those little pieces of paper, so I'm not 100% sure, but I think she comes apart. Although I don't think she comes apart quite as fully as the male characters. So anyway, articulation is still kind of the same. Like the knees I find are particularly ugly on the women. That looks not great. But otherwise, the elbows, the wrists, all that stuff, everything moves the same. So she looks pretty good. She's got her snake staff here. She's got her little shield. I don't think that's going to protect her from a whole lot, but she's got it. And then she also has this like snake armor. Now this snake armor was featured on Tila's vintage figure, and she wore it in the mini comics. That's back when she was kind of two characters in one. They kind of portrayed her as the sorceress / goddess. But in the cartoon, she never wore this big clunky thing. So you can take it off of her. Just pop it off the back like so. There we go. Just pops off like that. So she can shed that. And then you've got kind of the more classic Tila look with the little tiara and the like white bathing suit with the gold trim. So yeah, there's classic Tila for you. Now, I never had the vintage figure of Tila. Neither did my brother. So we never had Tila. And even the 2002 version, I wanted to get Tila. She was quite a bit different in that show in that they de-aged her. They made Tila and Prince Adam teenagers, which, you know, they were grown-ups in the vintage cartoon. At least I think they were. But yeah, I was never able to find that 2002 Tila either. So the only other Tila I have here is the Classics version. So this one came out, I think, probably around 2009. And she looks pretty great. So you can see the similarities, obviously. The tiara and the same style suit. And this one's obviously just a lot more detailed. A lot more detail on the weapons and on the snake staff. But still, you can see that these are the same character anyway. It looks really good. I'm really pleased with it. Now, this is one of the few examples where the Filmation version was a miss. So I have the Filmation version of Tila, and the previews for this figure looked really good. And if it had come out as good as the previewed images, I think I would say that was my default Tila as well. But I just don't love the way this figure came out. And I'm not the only one that feels that way. There was a lot of kind of blowback when Super 7 released this figure. Partly because of the face, but also there's some weirdness with the hips. Like she looks kind of weird there. I'm not as mad about it as some people were. I still think it's a decent figure. But yeah, it's definitely not the home run that the other Filmation figures were. So this one was a little bit of a letdown. But anyway, there you go. There are my Tila figures. So the last figure I have to talk about in Wave 1 is Evil Lyn. So this figure uses the same body as Tila, just repainted in Evil Lyn's colors. So that's just like with the vintage figure, except she does have a brand new unique head sculpt. And yeah, I like this figure quite a bit as well. I did not have the vintage Evil Lyn, neither did Doug. So yeah, we never had that toy in our collection. I do have a 2002 version of Evil Lyn, but I'm not going to show you her in this video because the 2002 version featured Evil Lyn in her cartoon colors. In the cartoon, Evil Lyn looked quite different from her vintage toy. Instead of the bright yellow skin and blue outfit, she had pale skin and a purple outfit. So Evil Lyn has always had these two very distinct looks. And in one of the later waves of Origins, they re-released this figure in the cartoon colors. So I'll show you that 2002 figure in those colors when we do that comparison. As far as this yellow skinned look, the only one I have is Evil Lyn from the Classics line. So this figure would have come out around 2009, 2010 maybe. But yeah, it's a great figure. I love the way this one looks. Some really nice painting in the face. Like her face, I think, is very, very well proportionate. It's the paint looks good on both sides. This one here, her face looks a little derpier, but it's still not bad. But yeah, you can definitely see the similarities in the outfits and everything. It's pretty much the same all the way through. Really great stuff. Now, one other thing I should mention about this toy line, I guess, before we wrap this up, is that just like the vintage toys, each of these new figures comes with a mini comic that kind of gives you a little bit of backstory about the character. So that's pretty cool. Now, I actually don't have Evil Lyn's handy because I've had this figure for a while and I tucked the comic book away. But from one of my more recent purchases, here's a version of the comic book, so the same idea. So you can see the size of it. It's just a small little thing that's in the package. It's got some nice, artwork and a very simple storyline inside. This one here is like 6 pages, I think. And then you've got a little bit of a cross promotion on the back. Show you some of the other figures. So yeah, that's kind of a neat pack-in. Very true to the vintage Masters of the Universe line. So yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say about Evil Lyn. But that is basically my video that's covering Wave 1. Okay, so that was my review of Wave 1 of Masters of the Universe Origins. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button. Maybe subscribe to the channel. And please leave me comments below. And I'll be back soon, probably with another video for Wave 2, where the other waves were all smaller, only 4 figures. Maybe I'll be able to mush 2 and 3 together. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, I'll be back soon, regardless, with something. So I will see you then. Thanks for watching. Ciao.